Hello, and welcome to the AUA Focus Series, a podcast channel by the AUA Media Lab. My name is Arshak Balayan, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Professor David Miller. Welcome.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here and to be in Armenia for the first time and to be taking part in this conversation.
Professor Miller, you are in Armenia to participate in a conference on national identity, and you delivered a keynote address. So you have been writing about national identity maybe since 1970s, and many of your, not only your writing on national identity, but on justice, on issues of immigration, etc., are very relevant for the problems that Armenia is going through. So I feel very privileged to have the chance of asking these questions. If I may, there are many topics we could discuss, but if I may ask you, you have claimed that communities are ethical communities, or nations are ethical communities. May I please ask you to elaborate? What exactly do you mean? Why are nations ethical communities as opposed to other communities that we don't call ethical communities?
So what I mean is that when we form part of a nation, we owe our compatriots special obligations that we don't owe to people outside. So I think of these as in some respects analogous to the kind of special obligations we have to family members and to friends. And in all of these cases, I think that what's happening is that we have natural emotions towards people with whom we identify, with whom we interact, with whom we share certain kinds of commitments and values. And when we form these groups, and this applies to groups of all kinds, we also begin to have reciprocal obligations. So we owe things to people we associate with, and they owe things to us. And nations, I guess, are special in this respect because not only do we have these informal person-to-person obligations, but we can also formalize them through political communities, through laws, through policies, and so on. And so they take a very concrete form, whereas in the case of friendships, for example, we just remain at the level of informal obligations and rights and duties.
So bigger community, where we don't know people in person, this informal emotional attitudes and relations cannot regulate our relations with others. And when the community is big enough, in addition to this emotional, positive, warm attitudes, we also need to come up with additional norms that would help us regulate our actions, coordinate our actions. Is that when a community becomes an ethical community?
Well, it's an ethical community right from the beginning. And so even if it's a matter just of personal interaction, I mean, imagine I don't know, you're in some foreign country and then you meet somebody who's one of your compatriots and they need help, then I think you would naturally give them whatever assistance they need more than you would to somebody who was a complete stranger. So it works at that level too. But then it becomes more important when we think about the way we organize our social life and our political life, and we have laws and we have policies. So, of course, philosophically speaking, there has to be a distinction between what we feel and what we actually owe, because some of these feelings that we might have would be entirely exclusive, and whereas the ethical obligations are going to be limited in certain respects. I think it's helpful to use a concrete illustration, which actually came up in the case of the COVID pandemic, when there was an issue about whether it was justifiable for states that manufactured vaccines to supply them in the first place to their own citizens, or whether they should be cosmopolitan and actually supply the vaccine to whoever it was needed the most. And for people like me, the answer was going to be that, yes, where compatriots were vulnerable, then you should give them priority. But at the same time, you also had obligations to people outside, to people in need in other countries. So if there was surplus vaccine, then you should also send it abroad. So that was the way I would. So whereas you might think that a very, very crude emotional response would be to say, forget about the others, let's just take care of our own citizens.
Right. So how much preference would a person be morally allowed to give to one's compatriots? So to use your example, maybe countries are allowed to give the preference to their citizens in need, but at one point, being more biased than a certain threshold probably would become impermissible. Can we describe that threshold? When is it that being biased towards my co-nationals makes me a bad person?
Right. This is going to be a tricky thing to set an exact line, but I think we can take our cue from the idea of human rights. So the claim of non-compatriots is going to be a human rights claim, as in the case of the vaccine. The vaccine posed a threat to life and to health, and so it was, in a sense, a human rights issue. Now, I think that citizens are entitled to more than just human rights. There's a kind of an additional layer of rights that we owe to fellow citizens. But when we've met that higher threshold, then the human rights obligations will begin to cut in. Now, exactly where that should be set, and so there was a debate about. So, most of us received several doses of COVID vaccine, and then at a certain point, it became clear that we were actually quite well protected, and that what was being offered was just some kind of insurance against what had become a relatively mild form of infection. And at that point, I would say, well, you've fulfilled the rights of the citizens, and now it's time to start. If there are people outside still in need of a vaccine whose lives are in danger, then we should start exporting. So that's roughly the way to think about it.
Right. It's a tricky question indeed,
Yeah.
and thank you very much. I would like us to move on to another very difficult question that you have discussed, and that's the problem of secession, or the principle of that requires or suggests to that recognizes for every nation to have their political autonomy, with obviously some limitations that you have discussed. In the world today, there seem to be, at least to me, that there are communities that are nations. There are collected in one geographical area. They have a history of political struggle for independence and recognition, for building their own state. They have lived in this area for centuries, but the international community nonetheless refuses to recognize their autonomy, to recognize them as a nation. So my question, I guess, is how important is it for nations to have political autonomy? That's going to be my first question, and I'm going to ask the other side of it. Why do obviously those who fight for it, they're ready to die for this independence, but the other sides also violently fight against this and deny them the right. So what are the reasons for denying people the autonomy or secession? And why is the right for autonomy so important for communities?
Yes, very good questions. So you're right to say that, at least subjectively, the right to self-determination is strongly felt, and we see it particularly, of course, in the decolonization moment. And it's important that the feeling of being in charge of your own affairs I think, is something over and above the mere fact that you think you're going to be better governed. So you hope you'll be better governed, but even if your rulers turn out not to be very effective, it's still important that you're governed by people with whom you identify, not by outsiders. So I wrote a book. The last book I wrote was a short book, which was called Is Self-Determination a Dangerous Illusion? And I tried to spell out why it was that people, correctly in my view, demand political autonomy, and the sense you have of being in charge of your own life that being autonomous gives you. Even though as an individual, of course, you only play a small part in that, nonetheless, it matters to you that you're part of a group that is self-determining. Now, the question is, why is that denied? Well, of course, in the international charters, it says every people has the right of self-determination. So it's there in black and white. But, of course, these charters are written by states. And in practice, international law recognises the right of self-determination on the part of established existing states, not on the part of subordinated peoples, except in the case of decolonisation. So, you can argue that the right is recognised in a limited number of cases, but not universally. So moving forward then, I think we do have to distinguish between secession from empires and secession from democracies. So there have been lots of secessions from empires. Empires have broken down, new political communities have been created out of them. What is actually much rarer is for democracies to split. There have been one or two cases. So most recently, I suppose, Czechoslovakia divided into two. And I think that when that happens, the international community will recognise the two independent states. Now, the difficult question is, under what circumstances should a democracy recognise a right to secede? And this is a very much debated constitutional question in my own country, where we've had one already referendum on Scottish independence. The same is true in Spain, for example, where the Catalans have demanded a referendum. So my view about that is that where a minority within a nation state, democratic nation state, can show that they are culturally and historically sufficiently different from the rest of the country, so it is going to be a matter of, to some extent, of judgment, then they should be given the opportunity to hold a referendum on secession. And so, my own case, although I'm predominantly English, my mother was Scottish, so I'm kind of Anglo-Scottish in a way. I very much regret if the Scots were to secede. I would say that if in a referendum a large majority of Scots decide they want to be independent, they should have that right.
Should the rest of the population in Great Britain also have a say whether Scots secede?
No, I think when it comes to the terms of the secession, then there's a legitimate interest on the part of the remainder community. So initially, the drive for Scottish independence was connected to the presence of large quantities of oil in the North Sea. And so if that had gone ahead, there would be a question about who owns the North Sea oil. And there, the rest of the UK has a legitimate interest. But on the question itself, I would support the right of a group to secede. Yeah,
that wants to secede. So interesting, very, very, very helpful comments. Let us exchange. I would like to hear your views about culture, and which is obviously related to national identity. Governments try to manage culture because through that they define themselves or redefine themselves, and obviously governments can make their national identity and culture less tolerant towards foreigners, or more tolerant, more inclusive, less exclusive, etc. But if I understand your work correctly, you say that culture and national identity is not, especially national identity, is not produced biologically. So whether the community or the group are Armenians, it's just they just recognize themselves culturally. You know, the markers are cultural rather than biological, for example. And culture and national identity are at least to some extent under people's control. So one might wonder is why would people not try to disintegrate into smaller groups? So let's suppose a group of British or maybe Armenians, they disagree about where Armenia should go and they decide to make two separate nations. Or why wouldn't they just try to integrate into a bigger community and say, maybe this group's identity is good, it's conducive to lots of public goods, it's appealing, so we accept their national identity and we basically integrate ourselves to the rest. Is this where we're headed, especially the second route? Are we in the process of nations integrating with each other, globally speaking? Is this something that we should resist?
Well, you're right to say that groups of people have rights to make these decisions and to choose. Of course, it's another question whether the choices are good ones and whether they're ones that they should take. I mean, I think we're allowed to stand back and say this was a bad choice or a good choice. So what's important, sort of politically, is that whatever the arrangement that is reached, that it should be democratically sustainable and it should support, liberal institutions. And so there's a question about at what level this can best be done. So the obvious example is the European Union, which is a very, very ambitious, almost unprecedented project. So there have been, for centuries, there have been various plans for some kind of European League. Kant and so on write about this, the idea of some kind of federation of states. But of course, the European Union has been a much more ambitious project. It's tried to get these very diverse political communities to come together and work on and to adopt similar kinds of policies on a whole range of matters. And I think that this is extremely difficult to manage, and it may be, in the end, democratically unsustainable. So, of course, the UK chose to leave, and so sometimes people think it was just some kind of panic about immigration, but actually I think the roots of it were much deeper, and that people genuinely thought that for many, many issues, the right level at which they should be decided was at national level. So they wanted to feel that laws, policies, environment, and so on could be controlled at that level. So, of course, you're right. People may decide, and there may be good reasons for joining larger international groupings, but there is still a question about how best to make decisions, what kind of level of decision-making is going to be most legitimate and most democratic.
Well, thank you. Is cultural diversity a value in itself? So you've been thinking about or discussing thinning down the national identities, which, if I understand correctly, is basically getting rid of all these elements of a national identity that would be annoying, troubling to the minorities and maybe neighboring countries, right? So that would be a step towards homogenization of all cultures, which, if we continue this process in a long historical perspective, we might lose some elements of culture or some cultures altogether. And I wonder, that seems to me the trend we are in at the moment. I'm not sure this is a right perception, but would this be a good place to go?
Yes, I'm not sure I quite accept your description of what it means to thin down a cultural identity. It's not, as it were, removing everything that's specific about it. So maybe it helps to again to take an example. So let's think about religion. So for many countries, a particular religion has been for centuries a defining feature, such that if you didn't belong to that religion, you were treated as a kind of subordinate class. So in my country, for example, for long periods of time, Catholics, as well as Jews, Muslims, and so on, were actually excluded from the public realm. So the thinning doesn't take the form of completely separating the religious dimension of culture from the national culture. It's compatible with still recognizing the importance of the Christian heritage, and I've argued that it's also compatible with having indeed an established church in the case of my own country. But the important thing is that it's no longer seen as necessary to belong to that church in order to be a full-fledged member of the community. So this idea of the rope that's made of many threads, which was the kind of image that Gina and I used in the cover of our book. So you don't have to grasp every single thread in order to be a full member, so long as there are several threads that are accessible to you to grasp. So somebody who, for example, in Britain today is a Muslim is not going to form part of the established church, but they can recognize that it's historically significant. And it's very interesting that, in general, Muslims don't actually argue for disestablishing the church. So, but then when it comes to many Muslims are Pakistanis or Indians, they love cricket. And cricket is one of the main national sports. So that element of identity is available to them, even though they won't sort of fully identify with Christian dimension. So that's what I mean by thinning. And so you're left with different and distinct cultures. And your opening question, is cultural diversity a good, is really, really interesting. But I think here I'm with Arshak Balayan, who said something like, a fully cosmopolitan world, a kind of a culturally flat world where everybody holds the same cultural values, will be a desiccation of everything that's human. So it's actually a value to us that in other places, different forms of life exist. It enriches all of us that there is diversity across the world.
Well, let me challenge a little bit. But so someone, I don't know if this historically was accurate, but someone might say, let's say, English identity is this religious Englishman, and be very and expect the public to accept it, to run policies that are that make this Englishman, religious Englishman, to be in a very good, comfortable place, to make it very easy to practice religion, and in fact, a little bit uncomfortable to not practice religion, etc. So it seems to be that the British community has thinned down.
Yeah,
I haven't heard any British demanding that. So for this identity of this, Englishmen being religious, devout Christians, it seems it's lost. Is it not a loss?
Well, I'm saying that the religious presence is still there. So in various kinds of, so when we have a coronation of a monarch, right, the crown is placed on the head of the new king or queen by the archbishop. And the church, even though rather few British people now are regular churchgoers, nonetheless, churches, I think, play an important part in social life. And, for example, supposing some sort of some tragedy occurs, maybe it's some kind of terrorist incident or a natural disaster, the church still becomes a natural focus for people to gather, to commemorate, and so on and so forth. So it's not the case that it's completely dissipated. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much. So do I understand right that you take nations to be entities that survive individual members? So the English nation or the Armenian nation today is the same nation that where maybe 500 years ago, although no one lived 500 years. Is this an accurate picture of what you take nations to be?
Well, it's it doesn't look the same. There's continuity. The overlapping threads idea, I think, captures this. So over time, the threads can be replaced, and obviously, one thread might be in the case of the British. The empire was obviously an important element of identity for several centuries, and now, of course, that's completely disappeared. So that thread has gone. There's a nice one of my intellectual heroes, George Orwell, asked the question, "What is the ongoing identity?" And he said it's a bit like a photograph. You see a photograph of yourself as a younger person, and you can recognise the similarity, even though many of your features. I used to have hair, for example. Many of your features have changed, but nonetheless you can recognise the same person. I think that was an interesting metaphor, that we can see over time nations change, but nonetheless preserve their identity through this overlapping threads. Yeah.
So the British have inherited many benefits of the empire. They are the right holders of some of the privileges of the empire. Does that also give the current generation of British responsibility for things that the British have done? Can a current generation have a responsibility to compensate for wrongs done by a previous generation, for example? And can a current generation have a moral obligation to do something for the future generation, maybe take care of the climate, for example?
Yes. I mean, yes to all those questions. And I wrote about this a bit in my book on national responsibility and global justice. And exactly because nations are historically extended over many generations, responsibilities pass down through the generations. And for exactly the reason that you give, the fact that in many respects we may have benefited, the case of imperial countries, from the spoils of empire, we also have responsibilities to restitute, to apologise, maybe to make financial reparations. So that becomes more complicated because of the passing of time and intervening events. But I certainly accept the idea of intergenerational responsibilities and also obviously towards the future.
Mm-hmm. And then it's a separate question how the responsibility should be split within members of the current generation.
Yes, I mean, I think that seems to it's a collective responsibility. So if it's a matter of resources and funding, whatever method of distributing internally is adopted would also govern that. Not a separate issue, I don't think.
Right.
You don't have to be sort of taxed more highly because your great grandfather was a administrator in India or something like this. It doesn't work like that. It passes down through the collective.
Okay. Right. I want to return to domestic issues, and as I said, most of your research is highly relevant for Armenia. And in one of your arguments in favor of liberal nationalism, you say that because people within a nation share identity, that helps them develop political trust and solidarity, economic solidarity, so that they create public goods easily and eventually build better democracy because they trust each other. They can move on to deliberative democracy rather than just merely formal democracy. Well, we in Armenia, we think of ourselves as monoethnic, or we are monoethnic country. So in that, and we have strong national identity. But it seems to me that I think we can say much bolder, we are struggling with building a good democracy. Whereas in other countries, maybe Canada, that has competing identities inside, or other countries that have multiple identities, they have managed to build good democracies. So it seems to me that argument, it takes us somewhere, but it doesn't. It depends on many other specific empirical questions or characteristics. And is this a good analysis of? Do I understand you correctly? And if yes, what would be the specific characteristics of identity that help one build a nation build a good democracy?
Right. This is very interesting, and you're absolutely right that some of the arguments that I've made in favor of national identity are crafted to respond to the facts of a society that's become increasingly multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, and so on. So, which is the case for most Western democracies, partly as a result of large-scale immigration, for example, but also just diversity of other kinds. So, so coming to Armenia, and exactly as you say, coming to a country where there's a single cultural group that is almost the exclusive group, means that some of those arguments, in a sense, become unnecessary. I mean, however, looking to the future, it may be that over time, Armenia becomes more diverse. And of course, it's also important to remember that there are other lines of cleavage and division besides the religious cultural one. And some of these may become more prominent over time. But I think what you've drawn attention to the fact is to the fact that social and political trust may be a necessary condition for democracy, but it's not a sufficient condition. And it may be that very high levels of trust could also go with excessive trust in, for example, authoritarian leaders. So the truth is that the building of liberal institutions with the rule of law, wide scope of individual freedom, I think is a project that actually takes a long time to consolidate. And I think many of us learnt hard lessons from attempts to promote democracy in countries that hadn't had a long history of liberal institutions. The sort of democracy promotion movement of the 1980s and 1990s. Also, the experience of decolonization was that many countries were given constitutions that on paper looked like immaculate liberal democratic constitutions. And often within the space of 2 or 3 decades, these constitutions had collapsed because they weren't supported by the kind of underlying ethos that you need to support liberal democracy. So I think you're right to point to the issue and say that it's not sufficient. Trust is not sufficient, but it may still, as I've argued, be necessary.
Right. So Francis Fukuyama, I think, in the book, it's called Trust, and it has a subtitle for I forget. He seems to distinguish between social trust and does he call it family trust? Let me present the idea rather. So some people would trust other individuals that they know, but others would just trust a fellow citizen. And with this, he tries to explain why, for example, there are large corporations in, let's say, Western Germany, Northern America, but not, let's say, in China. Because in China, they trust their family members, they trust their friends, but not a fellow Chinese. Whereas in the USA, as argument goes, they trust the fellow Americans. You might not know the details about the Armenian political situation, but could that be an explanation? Could that be a tool to use for understanding why some countries struggle with building democracy? So people trust their friends, their family members, those that they know, but they don't trust fellow citizens, even if they share the same identity. They don't trust institutions. And because they trust their friends, they always rely on their friends, they never trust the social institutions, and they never invest in building better institutions, because if they have some time and energy, they had rather invest in their friends, in their immediate network.
Yes, this is very, very insightful, and I think it's this cultural contrast that you're drawing. I think it applies in many cases. I mean, you could say one way of putting it would be to say that modernization is to some extent the replacement of that familial trust notion of sociality with a more impartial notion, where trust is exemplified through institutions and practices that are sort of impartial, as between family members and others. But it's a big transformation, and it may take a long time to. You can see it in. I mean, if you look back in the history of countries that are now liberal democracies, you can see that at a certain point, this sort of family connection model of how to build support and trust was predominant, and gradually over time it was replaced by notions of impartiality and the rule of law. But it takes time, and I don't have a recipe for accelerating the process, but that is in a sense what you have to do.
Well, thank you. The cameraman is telling me that we're running out of time, but before we conclude, may I ask what project are you working on? What's your current research?
So at the moment, my main concern is I'm trying to work towards a new book on the idea of meritocracy, which I have written about before, but has recently come under sustained attack from various quarters. And so I want to try to answer the critics and revive the idea. But I'm also interested still in questions about migration. I've been recently co-authored a piece about climate migration driven by climate change. And that, I think, is also an area in which I want to work in the future, working out how to deal with these issues where people are displaced not by conflicts and civil wars, of course that's going to continue, but also by climate change, and where the responsibilities lie in those cases. But for the moment, I'm grappling with issues about genetics, the family, and so on and so forth in relation to meritocracy, and that's quite a big task.
We're looking forward to the new book. And what would you advise to young philosophers who are just starting their career? What are the most important three, maybe, problems that you would advise them to think about, to write? Any general advice to younger colleagues?
Well, I think it's very hard looking forward, isn't it? I mean, I think we're clearly at the time of enormous social and technological change that is going to put great pressure on our idea of even what it means to be human. So I would be encouraging them to investigate issues like artificial intelligence, but also the biological notion of a human being. So these are really deep issues, and what question about at what point can we speak of AI having consciousness, for example, and also what kind of genetic modifications to people might be consistent with the idea of humanity. So these are really deep issues. On the slightly less fundamental maybe, but issues about obviously climate change, the responsibilities associated with climate change. So these are general issues. Of course, then also here in Armenia, there are going to be very difficult, pressing political questions having to do with territory and the issues that we heard yesterday from your Prime Minister, how to conceive of Armenia as a nation state under current circumstances. So it's going to depend where your philosopher is living. I'm very much somebody who thinks that philosophers have a responsibility to speak not only to the world as a whole, but also to their fellow citizens. So they must address local problems, but at the same time, they should be open to these much bigger, wider questions about what it means to be human, for example.
Professor Miller, thank you very much for this insightful conversation. And thank you for the advice. And we were in AUA Media Lab.